The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Michael Crabb, and today I'm joined by Robert Boswall to continue our series, Nuclear Nexus, Data Centers. So this series explores current development and energy challenges that data centers are facing, and speaks with different guests about, how different aspects of this burgeoning market come together to make this a reality.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Long-time listener, first-time caller. And yeah, there's a lot to get into here about energy sourcing for all corporates, but particularly at the moment it's data centers. They're really pushing the envelope on this, and get into their electricity needs, how those are being delivered, the sort of complexities and difficulties around that, and how we see that sort of potentially moving forwards.
Fantastic. Yeah, we've talked at a pretty high level about what these two businesses actually look like. And, today I think I'm really excited to dig into tactically. What does that work? How do we as a nuclear industry, right? We have nuclear listeners. How do they adapt to how data centers operate? And what are data centers going to have to, take as far as sort of different business lenses or risks in order to make this happen, and why they might do that? So that's a lot to cover. Let's dig in. Robert, maybe just give us some of your perspective on sort of the nuclear industry side. Like how have they acted historically, and what does that portend for supplying the data center space?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways it's actually, so the nuclear industry is currently, I mean, I speak mostly about the sort of UK GB landscape. But the nuclear industry is actually more of a lag on the broader energy industry, which is that in the UK, at least, we used to have a nationalized energy industry post-World War II. And so it was a very straightforward system. They put in an order for a coal-fired power station, and it got built, and it got connected to the grid. And that's how power came through. It was very much a centralized national utility. And then we go through various forms of market liberalization. And today, how a lot of generation gets onto the grid, it's hard to really break it down in terms of quantities, but how a lot of generation gets onto the grid today is through the contracted revenue guarantees of power purchase agreements, right? So this is how it's happened around a lot of the world, but the UK is particularly strong on this, in part because of the contracts for difference sort of regulatory setup, which is a lot like a government-backed power purchase agreement. And nuclear is catching up to this. Nuclear is figuring out that it can get in on the PPA game potentially better even than renewables can, because with dispatchable power, you have much better guaranteed profile of your revenues. You have a much better understanding of your revenue streams into the future. And also now that 24/7 matching is becoming a really big topic, but also just decarbonization in general, nuclear can really deliver on the corporate PPA model, which is very strongly in the spotlight in the context of data centers.
Yeah, so a lot of things to unpack there around sort of key value propositions for data center owners. But let's stick on this path with power purchase agreements. And maybe it's worth us discussing historically how data centers have sort of created this market, right? So 20, 30 years ago, energy markets were liberalizing, right? They were becoming deregulated, allowing market entrance in the space. There was trading of electricity, there was trading of gas, right? There were contracts for a certain duration for that. But it was really only the last decade, maybe 15 or 20 years. I know Walmart was a big pioneer of the corporate power purchase agreement, or PPA, but followed closely behind by huge purchases for the data center space. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in the UK in particular, suppliers are the linchpin of our market liberalization. So for every transaction in the UK, there are at least three parties. There's the generator, the supplier, and then the off-taker or consumer. So whoever's actually purchasing the power. And suppliers, partially through the creation of guarantees of origin, what in the UK are called REGOs, renewable energy guarantees of origin, but also just generally, suppliers started getting into the power purchase agreement game with a specific decarbonization green goal. So they're probably the nascent stage of this development. And then you're right, the data centers really put fuel on that fire. Really sort of said, okay, right, we'll take. It's Harry Potter on the train, right? I'll take the lot, right? any Rego you've got going, I want it. And so that really drove that, and also interestingly, and especially today, but for a little while now, has driven the advancement of the standard of what is acceptable in the PPA space, and especially the guarantees of origin space, because the actual guarantees of origin framework, both more broadly in the European Union, or more specifically the Association of Issuing Bodies, which is not exactly the European Union but very closely adjacent, and then in the UK with Regos, it's a pretty permissive system, and it's pretty sort of loose. And it's been interesting seeing how actually data centers are some of the hardest drivers they're some of the most carbon conscious energy purchasers. And they've really driven PPAs to get more creative, more flexible, more competitive, and more detailed in their decarbonization deliverables.
Yeah, and let's get more tactical into exactly what you're talking about, right? So you named the three counterparties. I'm going to just say them a little bit differently. You have your generation, you have your transmission, and then you have your end user, right? And so while generation has been deregulated, your transmission still tends to be regulated, right? And then the end user is obviously anyone that wants power. And so
Yeah.
they will plug into the system. They'll request an interconnection, or I guess in the UK, a connection, and they'll be able to draw power from the system. And so that historically has been the way this has worked, right? That your end user, your data center didn't know, couldn't trace exactly where they were getting electrons. And so the power purchase agreements that we're talking about here, they are virtual, right?
Yeah, so
talk to us about that.
not to sort of nitpick over it, but suppliers and transmission are different things. So like a supplier is your like octopus or your Eon, and transmission in the UK is all done by a heavily regulated entity called National Grid. So they are slightly different things, but yes, the sort of the innovation of the power purchase agreement is, as you say, it's this abstraction. It's this way of saying, because if we're going to get into if we're going to start talking about electrons, right? If you're connected to the grid, the actual electrons powering your home, your lights, or your manufacturing facility are probably from whichever generation is closest, right? That's the sort of basic physics of it. so what the PPA says is, right, it says, okay, look, we get that. We get that, you're actually being powered by your local sort of transmission or distribution network, the actual grid. But we want to create this connection between buyer and seller, specifically in the renewable case, because we have a sort of green premium, right? We have electricity is about as homogeneous a market as you can imagine, right? You literally can't tell the difference between one electron and the other. But as markets are wont to, they create a sort of premium, they create a distinction between their services, between their products. And that's what the PPA structure allows for. And that's the real innovation here, is to say, right, I can have a data center in, Slough, so just west of London, and buy power from, a wind farm off the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and make a credible claim that that data center is powered by the renewable energy. It is not literally, but you are supporting, sort of green development. You are helping to decarbonize the grid as a whole. And we as sort of human beings love an abstraction. And so that is a sufficient abstraction that we are sort of willing to accept, and we are willing to sort of pay a premium for, or at least data centers are willing to pay a premium for. What then gets interesting is you can really go down the rabbit hole in terms of the sort of the level of abstractions that you do and do not accept to make decarbonization and sort of emission scope claims. But yeah, so I hope that sort of answered what you were driving at about the real kind of innovation of what a PPA is, like how it came about and what its sort of value offering is.
Yeah, I think it's critical to point out, as they exist today, they're truly financial instruments, and I think you did articulate they have value, right? They are an interim step, and they're an interim step based on the best available solution that existed at the time, right?
Yeah, so I think
to be more sustainable. That's what you had. Okay, I'm going to buy. I know I'm adding 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts of demand on the grid. I can procure that same amount of energy on an annual basis, right, from a new wind plant, offshore somewhere, hundreds of miles away.
Yeah.
And that's at least additive in the macro sense, right? And that has driven a market that is valuable, as you said. It's created a premium product based on the attributes of what is otherwise a homogeneous commodity.
Yeah, and just not to get too technical on it, but to drive home your point about it being a financial instrument. So, like a virtual PPA or an over the grid PPA is actually a financial hedging instrument, right? It gets stipulated, regulated is the wrong word, let's say stipulated under the International Financial Reporting Standards. The IFRS may require buyers to like treat a PPA like a lease or a record or a liability that might have to be written as a liability or an asset on the balance sheet, right? Like these are quite complex, especially in the case of intermittent sources of energy. These can be quite complex financial instruments. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just worth understanding that it's not as simple as buying power from a wind farm, because what you actually have to do is they have to sell to the grid at a certain price. You have to buy from the grid at whatever price the grid, is at in that moment. You have to do a financial transaction around the back to make each other whole, depending on who bought or sold for more or less. So there's usually a third party in these. So that can be a supplier, that can be a sort of PPA structurer, if that's a word, someone who sort of puts together these PPAs. And that's only if you're considering, so there's a distinction between a pay-as-produced PPA and what is sort of becoming to be known as a baseload PPA, although that's not quite a sort of accurate term, but that's what people are calling it. So pay-as-produced PPA is a simpler financial instrument because it does what it says on the tin. You only pay for what is actually produced by that, let's say, wind farm. In the UK, it's usually a wind farm. But a baseload PPA, you submit, your profile of demand. Let's say it's, flat 24/7. and the PPA provider guarantees to deliver you power at either a fixed price or a index matched price or a sort of market floating price, and it just has to procure that, right? If the wind's not blowing at its wind farm on that particular day, that particular hour, it has to go and buy it from the market. And there have been some interesting instances of PPA providers getting pretty squeezed on the credit side because they suddenly have pretty substantial exposure to market risks, and the energy market has not been predictable or stable, let's say, in Europe recently. So that these can be pretty sort of complex financial instruments, and that's because people want what they're selling, right? People are only willing to accept this complexity and this kind of credit risk when there is a real value proposition.
Yeah, and so the value proposition is just getting greater, right? Like in the UK, what did I see the other day? That data centers consume approximately 10 terawatt hours a year of energy, 3% of your total electric use in country, right? And that's before what is projected to be exponential growth for uses like AI, right? And I don't think any of us are putting our phones down anytime soon, right? So
yeah, I mean, just to put a sterling figure to that, like a rego. So one rego is for 1 megawatt hour, and regos used to be what's a good time period to give? Let's say so about sort of 2020, regos were about 20p per certificate, and by 2023 they were about £25, right? So like that's the scarcity we're talking about here. That's the premium that these kind of renewable PPAs and low carbon PPAs are looking to secure.
And there's other challenges. So there's a clear market demand signal. There's a growing demand signal, and then there's some other challenges with the solutions that are available, or that people think are available, right? Which is where all of this complicated structuring comes in, trying to put a middleman putting someone in the middle of this transaction in order to manage that commodity risk, right? But that's just offloading the risk. It's not solving it. And this is where nuclear can play such a valuable piece, right? It sort of pulls back the curtain on all of this hand wringing that we're doing, and legal work that we're doing, and financial work that we're doing, and provides really the product that the customer needs.
Yeah, so I'd say nuclear has two unique value propositions in this instance. One is that you don't have to sort of force a round peg into a square hole. And what I mean by that is the round peg is the intermittent energy source, and the square hole is the baseload demand, right? So when you've got a baseload customer and you've got renewable generation, you have to go through various complicated credit or technological solutions, be that storage, be that sort of diversification, interconnector, etc., ways to try to create a baseload product or baseload service, whereas nuclear is inherently baseload, and therefore you remove that shape risk, you remove the balancing risk, you remove the additional procurement and the sort of price volatility risk. And the second thing is, and this is to be honest, this is a slightly stretched segue, but like, is the possibility for a physical PPA, because data centers will really struggle to. So just to distinguish what I mean by this, because people sort of cut these things differently. A virtual or financial PPA is just one that goes over the grid in some manner, goes through a transmission system. And a physical PPA is one that goes via private wire. So it's usually essentially co-located on site. And this value proposition to data centers in particular is massive, because no other low carbon energy source can really provide the base load and quantum of power that a data center requires. We're talking about tens, if not hundreds of megawatts. The kind of to provide that on a consistent basis from wind and solar like I don't even know. I could run the numbers on that, but I haven't, and it'd be pretty staggering. Especially since data centers do have a degree of location constraint, right? If they could build, up in the Outer Hebrides, then maybe that would be all right. But they do need to be relatively close to where they are being used. So that's one of the sort of serious value adds of co-location. Another is avoiding the costs of the grid. So in the UK, at least, system costs are about 60% of your final retail price of electricity. So 50 to 60. And if you don't use the grid, then you pay very few of those system costs. There is a degree to which you still pay some, but it's very limited. So you can, just half the price like overnight through co-location. And that's where like a nuclear PPA really can come into its own. Is a behind the meter over the grid product.
Which starts to sound like kind of a slam dunk, right? If you're saying, hey, look, we'll save you money, we'll save you time, we'll make it fully sustainable. Like, why aren't we doing this everywhere?
No, in terms of like, I mean, when you say that, I just start thinking of other reasons why it's a slam dunk. And I feel like I should push back and give the counter, but I'll give the, I don't know basketball well enough to know what's above a slam dunk, but to give the, I don't know, the 3-pointer, the other sort of things that co-location for non-nuclear as well, actually. So for renewable sources, this is also relevant for data center consideration, is the reduction of strain on your local grid, right? Because there are places in the world where data centers are just there are just literal moratoriums on them being built. It's just not allowed. Often, ironically, well, not ironically, because of this, but where there are data center hubs, that is where data centers are becoming banned the fastest. Your Irelands, your Netherlands, your Virginias in the US. But also there are other places where there are not moratoriums, but you will just never get a grid connection and you will never get planning permission because that area is just so congested on the grid. And if that additional supply, which is additional demand, which is pretty substantial demand, were to enter the grid, it would crash the grid. And that problem can be solved by, bringing your own power, BYOP. Like that really can help with, planning applications or with sort of grid connection to say, look, like we just need to connect to your fiber network, we're significantly reduced strain. And interestingly, that is also relevant just to sort of make this a broader conversation rather than just kind of constantly touting the horn of behind the meter nuclear PPAs, is that there's also some of the social license that new build virtual PPAs give data centers, right? Like if you're saying this wind farm off the coast of Suffolk is being built because of this data center, because of the guaranteed revenues or the contracted revenues that this data center secures for it, then that does, that does, social license is the best phrase I can think for it.
So it's a little bit of a dual-edged sword, right? Because it's like, oh, you're building this thing here, but for a plant over there, right?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. Like that's like, if we want to get into sort of systems considerations, there is a lot to be said against using corporate virtual PPAs to build an energy system, because you outsource a huge amount of the problems onto the transmission network, right? You can, data centers being built in the south of England, funding wind farms in the north of Scotland, when there's already substantial curtailment events that have to happen because there's huge congestion for transmission south of south of the border, there's a sort of substantial congestion zone between sort of let's say sort of Edinburgh and Sheffield, so sort of the north of England. So yeah, and it's been quite interesting watching the industry try to solve this through, frankly, ever more specific and complex energy attribution certificates. So a guarantee of origin is the kind of government-backed example of an energy attribution certificate, but they're pretty simple. They're pretty. I think it's fair to say that the industry considers them flawed, and by the industry I mean both data centers and sort of energy procurement as a whole. So people like Energy Tag and on top of it, so Energy Tag is setting up various standards for energy attribution certificates in terms of time matching and geographical matching. But even then, that doesn't really. So
yeah, I'm gonna pull you out of this rabbit hole.
Sorry, you know, I can go down that rabbit hole forever.
It's very important and very detailed, but I actually want to come back. You wanted to move off of the private wire microgrid type solution. I actually want to come back to that because to me, there's certainly a gap for a number of reasons, right? Not the least of which, just to tie a bow on it directly, all of those increasing transmission costs that you can offset by being private wire are a result of
absolutely
of intermittent resources placed really far away and pushing that strain back onto the grid. So that cost shows up for users' bills, particularly for data centers and energy intensive users, right? Lowercase, not the UK energy intensive users.
Oh yeah, let's not get into the schemes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And especially that comes back to social license.
Yeah.
Like I would love to see I don't know, social listening data or like survey data on how people currently view data centers and sort of an understanding of how that impacts them personally, because mainly it's about, you know, whether or not they're an eyesore, whether or not people dislike the construction disruption, etc. And those things, you know, developers have, you know, those are challenges developers have faced for, you know, time immemorial. So they have various ways to sort of work around that or compensate for that, etc. But it is a I think it is a serious problem, and it has shown up elsewhere. It's a very easy logical leap for people to make of saying, oh right, all these energy bills are going up, and there are all these energy hungry data centers being built. You know, that's not a hard leap to make.
Yeah, and I think what's funny is people I don't think have totally tied together that the cloud is actually anything but, right? The cloud is physical infrastructure that sits in the ground somewhere, maybe redundant physical infrastructure. I mean, it's why it's so important, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was actually the physical constraints. I know this. I'm told this is changing with AI data centers, but I wasn't aware until I worked on it for quite a while, like just how physically restrained the cloud is, right? You in the UK, there's the M4 corridor, like a lot of our fiber networks follow alongside our motorways. Like, you know, you have data centers locating in specific parts of Oxfordshire because that's where the fiber connection from America to Spain goes. And it's there for like historic reasons to do with World War II. And you're just like, wow, okay, this is like far more sort of like, doesn't it just beam into the sky and like, you know, Starlink looks after it? Is that not the internet? No? Okay, sorry.
Well, and it's in World War II, right? It's 70, 80 years of sort of digital infrastructure constrained by the use at the time. And sort of to your point around artificial intelligence, what some of our other guests have talked about some, right, is this idea of 10x, 15x, 20x demand per rack for an artificial intelligence use, but it has less latency requirement, right? Meaning it is more geographically flexible. And so you have this opportunity to cite where, what is your greatest constraint, right? That's power. And so if power becomes your greatest constraint, I think that brings us back to this idea of private network solutions with nuclear as the only baseload sustainable resource. And I think the coolest thing is that we actually are already seeing this, right? So the Talon sale to Amazon Web Services here in the U.S. For $650 million to build. There's an existing data center there powered exclusively by the Susquehanna nuclear power plant, right? And they're going to build Amazon is planning to build a 960 megawatt data center campus in 120 megawatt intervals, pulling power directly from a gigawatt scale nuclear power plant. And so, yeah, like that model, it exists. It's being done, right?
Yeah, I think I've been sort of working on a bit of a thesis, which is something like data centers need to understand that the scale they are looking at is the digital reindustrialization of the West, right? The West for the longest time has been reducing or flatlining our energy usage, both through efficiencies of energy usage, but also, frankly, through exporting energy usage. We just shipped it all out to China and India and sort of other parts of the world, and they did all of the energy intensive stuff. And so we have, to a degree, I'm of a believer that a lot of the UK's success in hitting our carbon targets is basically because we moved from being a manufacturing and product-based industry to a services-based industry. And now suddenly we are looking at a ramp up of energy usage in the West, and we haven't faced that in a long time, in like a really long time. And I think it is going to take really heavy lifting to do that. And the reason I sort of say that data centers need to think of themselves as the digital reindustrialization of the West is that when factories were built for the Industrial Revolution, they brought their own power supply, right? They just said, right, that's just how this works. That's a lot of how the grid was built. You can get into the US and it's really fascinating with the electrification of the US to a large degree was off the back of World War II. Huge amounts of manufacturing capacity was ramped up, for the sort of the factory of democracy that was America, is America. And then afterwards, that electricity needed to go somewhere, needed to be used for something, right? That's how these grids were built. And I think that the nuclear grid of the future will be built off the back of data center industrialization, right? Like that will be how this comes about, and bringing to an extent also that has been the case for sort of renewables, but I think that renewables do not fit the data center demand, and they also don't fit the data center standards. It is very interesting to me to see the degree to which the data center demand for low carbon power seems to be sort of really genuine. Call me a cynic, but I'm often looking for the sort of the workaround or the reason that this is just a sort of marketing ploy. And again, it seems to be like they're like, no, we actually just really do need and demand that this energy be. And of course, they're influenced by their customers, and data is an interesting one because people can shift cloud support much more easily than they can shift other suppliers. So if you manage to distinguish yourself as the decarbonized data center platform, you can, that is a competitive advantage because there's minimal friction to sort of switching over. But they really seem genuine. They really seem to be genuine on their positions on this. And the best I find litmus test for that is that they will hit a goal and then decide that goal isn't good enough and set a new one. And that to me is pretty remarkable. So we saw that with the 100% renewable requirement, right? And so 100% renewable was the sort of non-time matched target. That was we've bought enough guarantees of origin to offset our demand, even if some of those guarantees of origin were bought in Norway and used in Ireland, and there's no interconnector between Norway and Ireland. And sort of but you can sort of get into that was the first one. And then they said, okay, actually, this isn't good enough. No government told them that, no sort of, they signed up to the 24/7 carbon free energy compact, under the UN. It's been fascinating watching the degree to which this is a voluntary market, and it really is driving these innovations and solutions and the sort of the grid of tomorrow.
And I'll give you the business lens, in my opinion, as I look at that as well, right? Because I share your cynicism broadly. But I think there's also more and more a recognition from those data center customers of just how much power they need, right? I mean, Amazon's building a 960 megawatt data center campus next to that nuclear plant. Like we're talking about gigawatt scale demand centers that are going to come online at increasingly quick rates around the world. They need a solution that they can deploy at scale and at speed. And while you could do it with gas, I think there's recognition that like the market won't, like the space won't allow that, right? Like society won't allow you to build enough gas-fired power plants to solve that, right? We can barely get LNG export facilities here in the US to supply our allies in a time of need. And so I think there is some, well, yes, I think there's a genuine carbon focus. I do think there is like a self-preservation, like in order to hit anything remotely like the targets that they have for compute power, they need a really scalable solution. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that something it needs something to be energy dense, right? And intermittent resources aren't that.
Yeah, no, I don't really have a huge amount to add to that other than to say I am spending a good amount of time at the moment and still struggling to get my head around the kind of scale we're talking about, because I don't know, maybe part of me finds it actually quite, you see Google sign on the dotted line for $1 billion data center in Oxfordshire, and you look for the subheading where it explains how many government subsidies it got, and it turns out it didn't get any, and you're just like, oh right, they're actually like, this is go time, like
it's their business
going.
Yeah,
this is business. That they're building sort of 13 of them at any given time, and it's like, okay, wow, right, this is. And yeah, like I go back to the moratoriums, right? Like that's the fact that I think it's interesting. I'm sure to plenty of people this has been coming for a long time, but it feels to me like it's kind of snuck up on a lot of people. It's definitely sort of snuck up on me that data centers are already in the percentage points of electricity demand in countries, right? They're already at sort of 1 to 2, maybe 3% in some countries. And we're being told that, there's going to be a revolution of it. There's going to be an order of magnitude shift. We've already got countries saying that you can't build anymore. We've already got, sort of these massive investments going in. And you're just like, okay, right, this is happening yesterday. What can scale at that level? And this is the other thing, right? Okay, so on your point about the business case, sorry, having said I don't have a huge amount to add. On your point about the business case, I think the data center developers and procurers of data really do have to think about the sort of the hard realities, right? You can procure as much energy as you want from new wind farms in the North Sea, but if the grid is going down, right? If the power cannot get to wherever you're trying to build a data center, you won't be allowed to build it. There is definitely not the recognition probably that data centers deserve of the degree to which they are critical infrastructure. And because of this, they will be down the queue for like energy prioritization, let's say, right? So when push comes to shove, the data centers will be turned off to make sure that people have power, to make sure that hospitals have power, whatever it is. And I think there is probably a degree to which data centers probably should be taken seriously as critical infrastructure, but that's not, it's politics, right? And that's not going to be the case. So providing their own power in a visible, robust way, that will be a game changer.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see how that market continues to evolve with nuclear solutions that are sort of right-sized for that demand profile, right? And I think, um, I think about the intermittent PPA marketplace and set of tools and toolkits that are really valuable, right? Where we can take all of that learning and just apply what is a fundamentally better product for the solution that we're for the customer that we're trying to serve. And so it's almost like everything up to this point has been, I'm going to use a baseball analogy on you, but it's been sort of the minor leagues, right? It's been practice. It's been figuring out how to do this quickly and efficiently. And I think it's sort of the time for action for the nuclear space to step up, for the data center space to sort of step sideways, right? Maybe like step 1 foot out of their box and drive some of these solutions home. And I think it's really promising how much we're seeing of that actually start to come to fruition.
Yeah, it's so right sizing is a really interesting question in this area because people look at the Amazon Talon deal, and I think that's like a 2.3 gigawatt sort of power station. And you go, okay, wow, well, in that case, why aren't data centers building, why aren't they talking about sort of gigawatt powered nuclear power plants, gigawatt scale nuclear power plants? To which the answer is like deliverability, like timelines, and also scalability. So the thing that Amazon's pulled off an absolute coup, in my opinion. Like they're really well played to find a pre-existing nuclear power plant and snap that up, because that solves that. That's an easy option. But what they're now going to have to do is scale up to that full demand. Whereas if you were try to build a gigawatt power plant from scratch, the data center, it would be years before the data center was up to scale to take that demand, or it would be years, or in some cases decades, before the gigawatt power plant is actually built. So one of the great powers of data centers is their scalability, is the fact that you can get part of it up and running before you finish the whole thing, or you can build one and then sort of make it bigger over time. And that's also, the real strength of like micro nuclear solutions, that they can get up and running quickly and then scale in line with customer demand. Like those are two, really strong options. And like, especially in Europe, like there's not a lot of existing nuclear going, right? Like in the UK, all of our advanced gas reactors are being brought offline, by 2030 at the absolute latest. They're doing the best to kind of eke out what they can. And I mean, wouldn't be insane to hear that Google has bought Hinkley Point C. Like that could happen. That could put everyone out of their
Sounds
misery.
a little bit insane to me, but okay.
No, I'm kidding. They just like have one reactor maybe. But no, I joke. But like that's the importance of the fact that that's funny, I suppose, shows the importance of scalability, of delivery timeframes, of really finding that like size fit. And yeah, that's a very exciting sort of marriage of industries.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Robert, really great conversation. I know I kind of pulled you in 3 or 4 or 7 different
No.
directions, but
And you saved
really,
me from going deep on
only
a few
once,
things
only
that,
once.
yeah.
Really informative as always, and a great way to wrap up the 3rd episode of our Nuclear Nexus data center series. Really excited to continue the conversation. We're going to have more of this with in broader groups at Data Center World and other major data center conferences coming up over the next few months. And so, hopefully there are more announcements that we can all sort of talk about and use to grow this business together.
Great stuff. Thank you very much.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.